I want to begin this video reflection talking about, with Collins, the discursive positioning of a student, and in Collins, discursive positioning of a student in the 5th grade writing lesson, The Making of a Bad, Bad Boy. Collins talks about the idea of putting essentially a label on a student, labeling a student as bad, as a way to almost otherize them from the classroom. And we see in her case study how a teacher has essentially labeled a student as a bad student, and they find an excuse to otherize or kind of push that student out of the classroom and get them away from the main learning environment. This relates to the continuum of the troubling to troubled, which we see in the Hart et al. Article. And what they really focus on is the paradigm of punishment, where if we have a good student over here and a kind of what we've labeled as a bad student, and we've also labeled that good student as good, but we've labeled this bad student as being somehow bad, or oftentimes we'll label them as emotionally disturbed, which kind of fits under the idea of social construction of disability. But essentially, if we can't give the same punishment to each, because if we were to punish the good, give the same punishments that we give to the good student to the bad student, it wouldn't be effective. So in our minds, because this bad student is bad, they need a more severe type of punishment, and oftentimes that type of punishment will be suspension out of school or in school, really getting them out of the learning environment, which is counterproductive to their learning as well as their classmates' learning. And these both generally link to the social construction of both behavior and disability, in that how we view both of these is a very subjective lens. And this is why we see a larger amount of students of color being labeled as emotionally disturbed or falling into these bad categories that we've started to create. And it's a subjective view in that a lot of teachers won't check their implicit bias of the student and think about the student holistically. They're just looking at these minor incidences that they think are occurring regularly enough to be dealt with. To combat this issue, Duncan Andrade and Ware offer up solutions. Duncan Andrade, in his 2009 article, talks about the different types of hope that teachers and educators can use. He talks about 3 kind of negative hopes that we've often relied on, things like pulling one's self up by their bootstraps. But he also focuses on good types of hope, the material, the Socratic, and the audacious ways of hope, as being different ways that teachers can empathize and connect to students, such as like material hope being that a teacher can recognize that a student might need something, instead of saying, oh, well, that student should just somehow get it together. This teacher actually goes out of their way to help give them, be it a material thing, or like, such as like maybe the student doesn't have enough lunch money, so they give them a sandwich or something like that. That's just a really obscure case, but they assist them rather than looking down on them. As well, Ware, in her 2006 article, discusses the idea of a friendly demeanor being as, quote, a form of culturally responsive teaching. And this ties back to the Andre article, where we see that we need to think about our students more holistically, as well as we need to think about how to best approach them, and we need to get to know the students and where they're coming from before we can actually begin to teach them. And this has slowly begun to influence my pedagogical philosophy, in that I need to be better prepared to think about the different types of hope and the different background things that might be going on in a student's life that might prevent them from being holistically there in my classroom. As well, I need to be prepared to not rely so much on things like discursive positioning and labeling a student as good or bad, as well as making sure that every student within the troubled to troubled paradigm, making sure that every student experiences the same level of discipline, whether that if the discipline is necessary, that the discipline should match from each student to each student, but not saying that like you should treat each student very cruel, but you should also get to know why the student is acting out in your class.